Matthew's gospel, this particular passage, is hard to read. It's hard to read. And it's especially hard to read because of that last part. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. That's tricky. But it gives me an opportunity to teach you all a little bit about setting Scripture in context. This lesson needs to be held in context for it to open up and offer the good news that it has to offer today. I remind you this morning of what you may know, that Matthew's gospel was written in around the year 70 in the Common Era. So that's at least 40 years, coming up on 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. It was a time when the Christian community had spread. There were churches, congregations, a developing Christian presence throughout the ancient world. But Christians were being persecuted. Up until the year 70, they were very much being persecuted by Jewish authorities, and then they were also persecuted by the Romans. 70 also marks the year when the Romans came in and destroyed Jerusalem. This is the year when the temple was destroyed, and that was a significant moment. The world, as the Jewish authorities and as most Christians knew it, had been upended. This is the historical context in which we read this passage. It is a word written to and for people who are under threat, whose world is making less and less sense, where doing right does not turn out to be rewarded. Jesus speaks. He speaks and he says, I am not abolishing the law. Verse 17, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. So I just want to take a moment to say, this line is a hedge against successionism. That is the unfortunate impulse of Christians over many times and places to believe that Judaism was the old way and Christianity is the new way, and therefore, if you are still clinging to the old ways, you're a fool. To abolish the law and the prophets means to wipe away all of Hebrew scripture. Jesus says clearly in verse 17, I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. I would also, as a side note, mention to you that when you hear me read from the prophets, from the book of Psalms, I refer to it as Hebrew scripture, not as Old Testament. I do not want us to be the kinds of people who think that there's an old way and a new way, and we are of the new way, therefore better. Nuh-uh. Be careful. Hebrew scripture. So Jesus is not coming to abolish the law, but to fulfill it, and therefore we have to look to Jesus as the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. If you're trying to understand what the law of Moses, what the prophet is talking about for Christians, look to Jesus and see what he's doing. And then at the end he says that thing that makes us all very uncomfortable. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. That is some bad news. Bad news. Our righteousness has to exceed the scribes and the Pharisees, people that we know historically spent all their waking hours attending to the letter of the law of Moses. They were making very certain that they did not violate the law. In fact, vast volumes of literature were written, commentary on Hebrew scripture, interpreting the law, so that people could make sure that they never broke the law. They wanted to live according to the letter of the law. But as I said, context is everything. Jesus says these words about righteousness just before he launches into a long excursus on reinterpreting the law of Moses. Maybe you've heard these lines. You have heard it said, but I tell you today. You have heard it said, but I tell you today. Jesus, in what follows our reading, goes into a long discussion of many subjects: anger, adultery, oaths, divorce, retaliation, how to treat enemies. And he takes each of these subjects and he looks at what the law of Moses requires, the letter of the law, and then he moves deeper and says, oh no, there is a deeper intent. In essence, what Jesus is setting up for us in this passage is a distinction between what the law says and what the intent of God is in offering the law. There is the letter, and then there is the intent. And the intent, my friends, is righteousness. Our call is to live according to the intent, not to the letter of the law, to be righteous people, not just to fulfill the requirements of righteousness. In essence, Jesus calls everyone within earshot, including us today, to live a godly life. Let me repeat what I said last week. It's not what we do, it's who we are. And that's everything. That's what we do, what we think, how we act, how we move, how we feel. It's not what you do, but who you are, and we are followers of Jesus. And with Jesus, it's never been about interpreting the letter of the law, but living according to the law of love and mercy, peace, and justice. That's what he's calling us to. That's what he was calling his disciples to. So why do you think Jesus is being so particular about this? Why does he care about a distinction between the letter versus the intent of the law? Because the truth is, we are really, really good at obeying the letter of the law, but not the intent. In fact, I would go so far as to say that human beings are masters of the loophole. We figure out where the space is, where we can do the thing we wanted to do anyway, and within the confines of being technically righteous, we will go our own way. This is Jesus just sewing up all those loopholes because he knows us. He knows who we are. Don't you know? Anyone who has had children knows that we are masters of the loophole, right? I learned this with my children when they were young. No matter what rules I set on things, they would find a way to slip through the cracks. Now, the worst one was probably my youngest son, Ren, who didn't come to church today, so I'm going to tell this story about him. You're welcome, Ren. When Ren was in preschool, so he must have been about a year and a half, he started a new preschool program at Trinity Lutheran Church. And you know how it is with toddlers. There's always that settling in time where they're learning how to live within the classroom, to follow the rules, this kind of stuff. So after the first week of my dear little toddler Ren's time at Trinity Preschool, I came to meet with the teachers and find out how he was doing. Is he settling in? Is he participating in the right way? Is there anything I need to do? And they said, oh, he's great. Ren is a wonderful child. We're just working on him not picking up the other children. Picking up the other children, I said. Is my son, who mind you was a big kid then, and he is a big kid now, Ren is picking up the other children? Why is that? And they said, well, because we have a rule in the classroom that you can't take toys away from your friends. So Ren's been taking the friends away from the toys. It was his own masterful catch and release program. If someone had a toy that he wanted, he gently picked the child up and moved them to another part of the room so that he could have his toy. The teacher looked at me and she said, I can't fault him. Technically, that's allowed. We're laughing, but we are all searching for those loopholes, aren't we? And so are the disciples. Let me remind you what Scripture says. Jesus says to the disciples, you must always forgive. And somebody says, how many times must I forgive? Jesus says you must love your neighbor, and someone says, precisely who is my neighbor? The disciples are looking for the exact guidelines so that they can figure out what they must and what they don't have to do. And Jesus doesn't let them off the hook, nor does he let us off the hook. We can parse out the requirements all we want. We can try and figure out so that we are within the confines of righteousness, and other things we do don't count because we want our hands clean, even if our hearts are not. But Jesus wants your hearts. With Jesus, it's always about love and mercy and justice and peace. Jesus is always saying to us, you have been so magnificently loved, so you shall love others. You have been so ultimately and completely forgiven, so you should forgive others. And we're looking for the loopholes. It's hard. I think what's hard about it is that this world is not rewarding being loving and merciful or being just and peaceful. The world has never worked that way. It didn't work that way in Matthew's time. It's not working that way in this time. In Matthew's time, as I said, the Romans were destroying Jerusalem. The oppressed were oppressed. It was a time of famine and war and peril. People who stood up and said they were Christian risked everything, their lives, their livelihood, their families, their reputations. Everything could be taken away if they lived according to the ways of Jesus. And quite frankly, don't you wonder what Matthew's congregation was thinking? They were looking at how the world was working, what was happening to them, and this call of Jesus to be loving and forgiving and just. And they must have wondered, what does it matter? Does it make any difference if I actually live according to the ways of Jesus? According to the rules of the world, it doesn't seem so. That's why the first part of this passage matters. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Salt and light. I have to tip my hat to Jim Wallace's book, Christ in Crisis, Why We Need to Reclaim Jesus. He uses as his final chapter this verse from Matthew, salt and light. We are called to be salt and light. And Wallace points out something that we may have forgotten, that in the ancient world, salt was used as the one preservative. You would pack things in salt so that you could get them later. There would be food in lean times. There would be things you could come back to. Salt is a preservative. We are the salt of the earth, and therefore we are called to preserve what is good, what is righteous, what is of God. Think about the things that Jesus lifts up for us. It's about honesty and integrity and compassion. It's about faithfulness and fairness and fidelity. It's about dedication to teaching our children the ways of right and wrong, no matter what the world says. We are the salt of the earth because we are trying to preserve what is good. But we are also the light. The light. And Jesus says, in the darkness, one light can cast so much brightness. It shines in the darkness, doesn't that light? And it reveals what is wrong, what is untrue, what is misshapen and misformed. A light in the darkness alerts us to the dangers to life and to dignity. It shows us the things that people are trying to hide. We are salt in preserving what is good, and we are light in shining and identifying the things that are not right. That's the call. Preserve what is good, shine a light on what is bad, and do it all with the kind of love and mercy and grace of God that has been given to you. That's the call. No matter what the world does to you, no matter how the world is operating now or at any other time, no matter how we may be punished or how we may be ignored or mocked for it, we are called to do what is right. To be salt and light, people of faith, people who follow Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not going to get much farther into this. I'm going to point out, though, that Senator Mitt Romney, who I've had many disagreements with in the past, stood up and did a pretty gutsy thing. He said, I am going to honor my oath. Do you remember Psalm 15 from last week? O Lord, who may abide in your tent, who will dwell on your holy hill? And verse 4 is, those who stand by their oath even to their hurt. Well, he did it. He stood up to his oath even to his hurt, and he is going to be vilified and punished for it. But Romney knows what Matthew's talking about. He knows what Jesus is calling us to. Romney knows that we are supposed to be salt and light. We are supposed to preserve what is good and shine a light on what is not good, even if we suffer for it. Because with just a pinch of salt, with just a little light, the world can be changed. That's what we are called to do. Context is everything. Context is everything. This lesson about righteousness, about calling us to a righteousness that exceeds the scribes and the Pharisees, does not mean that we have to get everything right. It means that we have to strive day after day to be right. And in the world that will not recognize it or reward it, we still have to do that because we are not of this world. We are the people of God's kingdom. Thanks be to God. Amen.